In 1907, thousands of workers arrived in Panama, expecting to build one of the greatest engineering projects in history. But beneath the jungle, their tools struck something no construction map had recorded. At first, it looked like ordinary stone. Then another wall appeared. Then an entire street. As the excavation expanded, the workers realized they hadn't uncovered scattered ruins. They had stumbled onto the remains of a forgotten colonial city that had vanished centuries earlier. The deeper they dug, the more impossible the discovery became. In the dry season of 1907, the central district of the isthmus was a chaotic expanse of steam, steel, and shattered earth. Hundreds of railroad and canal workers were grading the right-of-way for the Panama Canal Railway, their steam shovels tearing through tons of clay and volcanic rock. It was routine, grueling labor. But during the excavation, the steady rhythm of the heavy machinery suddenly ground to a halt. At a depth where engineers expected only soft swamp and clay, the heavy iron buckets of the shovels struck an unexpectedly solid layer. At first, the crews assumed they had simply hit bedrock or a massive boulder buried in the tropical soil. It was a common frustration in this terrain, but as laborers stepped forward with shovels to clear the surrounding earth by hand, the true nature of the obstruction became visible. The exposed material was indeed stone, but it was shaped. It was flat, uniform, and bound together by an ancient, crumbling mortar. How did dressed masonry end up buried yards beneath a dense tropical forest? The official record of the Isthmian Canal Commission preserved this moment of confusion with bureaucratic simplicity, noting only that large stone walls and foundations were encountered. The workers did not yet know they had breached the perimeter of a lost world. They only knew their tools had met a barrier that did not belong in these wild hills. Suspicion quickly replaced frustration. As the dirt was brushed away, the straight lines of the masonry revealed something far too orderly to be a natural formation. This was not a random pile of rocks. It was a deliberate, massive structure. And as the crew stared down into the trench, they had to ask, who built these walls, and what else was waiting beneath the clay? The crews pushed their iron shovels and pickaxes further into the heavy clay, expecting the obstruction to end. Instead, the stone appeared again and again, in forms that clearly suggested deliberate masonry rather than loose, natural debris. This was not a single isolated obstacle. As the steam shovel scraped away more of the wet earth, the shapes began to form a clear pattern. Workers clearing the slopes of the railway cut with hand shovels noticed that these stones were neatly aligned, forming thick, heavy walls that ran parallel to their excavation lines. The digging was no longer just an engineering task, it had become an unearthing. The exposed walls showed that the excavation was uncovering built remains on a scale that defied easy explanation. Within days, the workers realized they were not merely dealing with a ruined outpost or an isolated Spanish fort. They began to find horizontal pathways paved with flat river stones, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic. Branching off from these stone streets were the collapsed stone footings of large buildings, the foundations of private homes, and the unmistakable broad outlines of churches. What had started as a frustrating delay for a railroad grading crew was widening into something far more massive. The foundations extended much farther than anyone expected, stretching deep into the uncleared jungle and under the heavy clay banks of the Culebra Cut. Layer by layer, a buried settlement was emerging from the tropical dirt. The physical footprint of this forgotten place did not match any modern map of the canal route. Yet there it was, sitting directly in the path of the 20th century's greatest engineering project. The labourers, working in the humid heat under the shadow of the steam shovels, could see the orderly layout of an entire community. It was a grid of streets and structures that had been completely reclaimed by the earth, waiting in silence until the railroad cut sliced it open. The masonry uncovered by the railroad crews belonged to a grand colonial experiment, far larger than a temporary outpost or a forgotten military fort. These structured stone lines represented the very birth of European urbanization in the Pacific. To understand how these heavy foundations ended up buried beneath yards of tropical clay, the timeline must shift back nearly 4 centuries before the arrival of the American steam shovels. The origin of the ruins traces back to August 15th, 1519. On that day, the Spanish governor Pedro Arias de Vila officially established a new settlement on the edge of the sea. He named it Panama. This was a deliberate strategic anchor for Spanish imperial ambitions. Davila chose a site near a natural harbour, seeking an outpost that could connect Spain to the unexplored waters of the South Sea. With this act of founding, Davila established the first permanent European settlement on the Pacific coast of the Americas. At the time, the vast ocean stretching westward was a profound mystery to European cartographers. This new outpost became a critical, isolated foothold on an unfamiliar shoreline. It was a gateway designed to face an entirely different ocean, separated from the established Spanish ports of the Caribbean by miles of dense, mountainous jungle. The early town was plotted in a systematic grid, reflecting European architectural traditions. Settlers constructed homes, administrative offices, and early churches directly on the coastal plain. Yet, the very ground they chose would eventually seal their history. How did this pioneering settlement, built with such permanent intentions, end up completely swallowed by the earth? What began as a fragile coastal outpost soon became the narrow bottleneck of an empire. The discovery of silver in the highlands of Peru transformed the destiny of this quiet Pacific settlement. Because Spanish ships could not easily brave the stormy waters around the southern tip of South America, Panama Viejo became the gateway through which South American treasure had to pass on its way to Europe. Every spring, the Spanish South Sea Fleet arrived at the city's harbour, laden with heavy bars of silver and gold extracted from the mines of Potosi. Labourers unloaded the cargo onto the stone docks, where it was catalogued by royal officials before being packed onto massive mule trains. These caravans then set off along the Camino Real, a narrow stone path cutting through the thick, swampy jungle of the Isthmus, bound for the Caribbean coast, where galleons waited to sail for Spain. This transit role made Panama Viejo one of the wealthiest ports in the Spanish Empire. Historians estimate that roughly 60% of all the silver bound for Spain passed through this single point on the isthmus. While much of the treasure continued onward, a significant portion remained in the local economy. Merchants built elegant residences, and religious orders erected grand stone monasteries and churches, their altars decorated with gold leaf. By the mid-17th century, the population grew to nearly 10,000 people. The city had become the beating heart of Spanish commerce in the New World, a place defined by its role as a bridge between oceans. Understanding this immense wealth makes the silence of the ruins eventually uncovered by railroad workers all the more striking. The immense wealth that flowed through these stone streets also made the city a prime target. In January 1671, the English privateer Henry Morgan marched across the isthmus with a force of 1,400 men. The resulting battle and a devastating fire reduced the sprawling stone metropolis to ashes. When the smoke cleared, the original settlement lay completely devastated, its grand stone churches charred, its homes destroyed, and its population scattered. For the survivors, the blow was absolute. Rather than attempting to rebuild on the scorched ruins, Spanish authorities made a definitive decision. In 1673, just 2 years after the raid, they established a new Panama city on a more defensible peninsula, roughly 10 kilometers to the west. Why did they abandon the original site entirely? Historians suggest that the old harbour had become increasingly difficult to defend against naval threats, and its shallow waters had long hampered the larger galleons of the late 17th century. By moving to the rocky promontory of what is now Casco Viejo, the Spanish could construct a heavily fortified walled city shielded by natural reefs. With this relocation, the old site ceased to function as the centre of settlement. The ruins of the first Pacific metropolis were left entirely to the elements. The administrative offices, the grand plazas, and the merchant quarters were permanently abandoned. What had once been the primary commercial gateway of a global empire was suddenly silent, its remaining stone arches and charred foundations standing as quiet monuments to a fallen era, slowly waiting to be overtaken by the surrounding landscape. The silence that settled over the abandoned ruins of Panama Viejo in 1673 marked the beginning of a quiet, relentless transformation. For over 2 centuries, the physical memory of the former imperial port dissolved into the tropical environment. It was a slow, systematic concealment. The secondary forest reclaimed the charred masonry block by block. Soil core analyses and pollen records from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute show a stark environmental shift during this period. The cultivated fields of maize and beans that once fed 10,000 residents rapidly gave way to a wild, aggressive jungle canopy. But the forest was only the first layer of this vanishing act. How did massive stone walls disappear entirely from the surface of the plains? Beneath the green canopy, geologic forces were actively reshaping the terrain. The nearby river network carried continuous alluvial deposits across the coastal plain during the annual rainy seasons, washing silt and clay over the stone foundations. Over decades, this riverine erosion and sediment accumulation formed a heavy earthen blanket. Soil cores eventually measured a mean burial depth of over 2 meters across the site, sealing the streets from view. At the same time, the relationship between the ruins and the sea began to warp. Coastal accretion and shoreline migration gradually pushed the ocean back, silting up the original harbour where treasure galleons had once anchored. The bustling port was slowly marooned inland, surrounded by wetlands and shifting mudflats. Archaeological evidence suggests this was a gradual, silent reclamation by the earth. By the time the 19th century arrived, the grandest stone towers and street grids had been thoroughly absorbed into the topography, hiding a global capital beneath a flat, deceptive carpet of green. The transition from a chaotic construction hazard to a recorded archaeological site began in the offices of the Isthmian Canal Commission. In June and July of 1907, as steam shovels under the direction of Major David de Beauce-Gaillard tore through the high ridge of the Culebra Cut, the physical reality of the ruins forced a change in the engineering routine. No longer treated as mere obstructions to be blasted away, the masonry walls required systematic evaluation. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Colonel George W. Goethals and Supervising Foreman John M. Hogan ordered the excavations near mile marker 8.5 to be photographed and catalogued before any further grading occurred. This decision turned a daily construction anomaly into a permanent historical record. The 1907 annual report of the Isthmian Canal Commission formally documented the find, detailing walls over 1 meter thick bound by ancient Spanish lime mortar. These official logs, supplemented by detailed fieldbook entries, altered the understanding of the canal's progress. While working to construct a modern transit route, the crews were actively cutting through the structural skeleton of the oldest European city on the Pacific. By documenting the exact coordinates of the paved streets and church foundations, the Commission's engineers created the first modern survey of the buried ruins, anchoring the physical remains of Panama Viejo in 20th century records long before the first ship would transit the canal. In the decades following the canal's completion, systematic excavations transformed these isolated construction obstacles into a fully realized urban blueprint. Teams of archaeologists began tracing the true scale of the buried settlement, uncovering far more than simple stone walls. They documented an organized network of streets, stone convents, municipal buildings, fortifications, and communal cemeteries. From the heavy clay, researchers recovered thousands of everyday objects: Spanish silver coins, bronze crucifixes, local ceramics, and imported Chinese porcelain that matched the domestic life of a wealthy global trading hub. But how did these scattered remains fit together? To reconstruct the original city plan, researchers compared their field coordinates with 16th century cadastral maps preserved in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville. The old Spanish designs aligned perfectly with the excavated masonry. The stone-paved streets, measuring 12 meters wide, matched the rectilinear grid plotted by Spanish surveyors in 1519, allowing investigators to identify the exact locations of the Grand Cathedral Plaza and the Municipal Council House. Collaborative studies by the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute further analyzed the soil layers, pollen records, and vegetation patterns, converting a series of accidental construction finds into a mapped colonial footprint. This work proved that the structures uncovered by the steam shovels were not isolated ruins, but part of a highly structured imperial capital. By overlaying archival maps onto modern stratigraphic drawings, researchers restored the lost outline of Panama Viejo, revealing the precise boundaries of the first European city on the Pacific. Today, container ships glide past the very shores where an empire once fell. Panama Viejo remains not just a preserved ruin, but a quiet warning. In our relentless drive to build the future, we are always walking on the ruins of the past. What forgotten worlds are we paving over next? Subscribe to join us on our next excavation into history.